We're doing this part in English because we have a man here who is quite versatile in different countries and world politics when it comes to drugs. First of all, I would like you to just introduce yourself and tell me what you do.
Thank you, Alexi. I'm Teivo Teivainen and I work as professor of world politics at the University of Helsinki.
And how would you say that drugs play a part in world politics? Maybe you can give a bit of a, maybe even a historical account of all the international treaties and such and how this kind of been playing out. I mean, it's a broad question and there's a lot of details to kind of go.
Well, for me, there are different dimensions to the question of drugs in world politics. As someone who's spent quite a lot of time and worked quite a lot in Latin America, also in the United States. One dimension has to do with violence and political economy and coca production and trafficking and political dealing and wheeling around it. And perhaps another dimension to me has to do more with political theory and what kinds of, sort of philosophically grounded norms and rules and ways of thinking there are, especially within sort of liberal or libertarian ways of thinking that make us believe in autonomy of the individual and principle of individuality and what grounds there are for controlling substance use. So there are two different kinds of dimensions that I see as my work as professor of world politics or political theorist there, and so I've been interested in these various aspects. In Peru, in 2002 maybe, founded something called Program on Democracy and Global Transformations, where we did some work together, for example, with Transnational Institute based in Amsterdam on different aspects of drug policies, especially the coca question in the Peruvian Andes and the valleys with the coca production. So I was following that a little bit also in Bolivia. Perhaps one of my initial interests in the topic was way back in 1988. I was, as a very young guy, for some reason appointed as visiting scholar at the State University of New York in Binghamton. And there was this event by this organization called NORMAL, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, back in 1988. And they were showing like movies like Reefer Madness and stuff. And as I expected, quite a few people would be like, the usual suspects, like, lefty hippies who come there to laugh and get stoned and, and kind of reform the marijuana laws. But then there were also some other people who were like Milton Friedman and Ayn Rand and, first come, first served principle and kind of hardcore right-wing people there. So I got interested in the ideological variety around drug reform, for example, in the United States and around this organization that's played an important role in the United States, NORMAL, National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. So these are some of the backgrounds on how I got interested and involved with the thing.
And how do you think are the biggest changes that you've seen in the last, let's say, 10 years? I mean, there's been a lot of development on national, but also state level in the US in particular, especially, I think, around cannabis.
Yes, there have been. One of the processes I follow with most interest is the Uruguayan one, which was the first sort of national statewide reform when there was something one could call legalization, where the state took control of various aspects of production and distribution. Of course, in Uruguay, something people sometimes forget is consumption was for a long time not criminalized, so it has some sort of liberal tradition there. And then also as a scholar of world politics, what Uruguay was doing was clearly and explicitly breaking some international legal obligations in the Single Convention of 1961 and other norms, and when Canada followed Uruguay, in some sense not doing exactly the same sense, but also like Canadian foreign minister saying, look, now we are breaking international law. And it's interesting for countries like Uruguay and Canada that are not seen as rogue states or anything, to explicitly go against international legislation is kind of rebellious act, which is then interesting on how you change whether you first reform the laws or whether you do something like civil disobedience, normally in a national context, and whether what Canada and Uruguay were doing was something analogous to civil disobedience in world politics. And I think it's been an interesting process, and when they started doing this, like Uruguay in particular, with the like I don't know, 15 years ago, starting with this idea like we'll bring human rights into international drug discussions, and I was like talking with this guy who was ambassador in Vienna in the drug convention, wheeling and dealing thing, and you know, then he comes with this new, and now it sounds kind of obvious. Of course, we have to talk about human rights when we talk about drugs, but in the old days, this was like a new thing. Then, like the Chinese ambassador saying, no, human rights, you go to Geneva, this is Vienna, we don't talk about human rights here, we talk about drugs. And what I liked most, he said, he was talking with the ambassador of, I think it was Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. He was saying, hey you guys, if you say it's so fucking revolutionary, how come your drug policy is straight from the, you know, the playbook of George Bush and war on drugs? You know, what's that, comrades? You know, so also within the sort of Latin American left, it's been interesting to observe different dimensions there.
And we're gonna watch a little teaser of a documentary about Uruguay later on that you've been working on as well. Kind of maybe bring it a bit closer to home. How do you kind of see the discussion going on in Finland at the moment, for instance?
Well, it's certainly changed. I mean, the way some politicians talk about it, I remember back in not so many years ago, I was talking about this also with HPP, who's organizing this event, and then when saying, you know, we need to discuss this and all that, sounded like perhaps a bit more novel. Now there is a discussion, and it used to be for politics here. I was talking about this with many members, some members of parliament, like, okay, but personally, you know, you agree with drug reform, why don't you bring it up? And then, well, you know, it's complicated, the voters don't like it, you bring it up, you get labeled as a druggy, kind of hippie, stoner, or whatever, and it seemed especially, it was funny sometimes, especially for younger politicians, who would be in the age where, let's say, smoking marijuana was for their cohort much more normal than for perhaps older generations. But then you would see like questions around this, and sometimes very old people or relatively old people would be more open about these themes, and young people would be out, they think we are hippies anyway, so we have to avoid this thing. So that has changed. So now there's a serious conversation. Of course, it's mostly localized within a couple of political parties, kind of usual suspects, Greens, more on the left, but then also occasional politicians from other parties, the more mainstream conservative Communist Party, you know, it's there, and even the more hardcore right-wing parties. So the debate has changed, and most strikingly, what I sometimes tell people, did you know the National sort of Health Authority, DHL, they are in favor of decriminalization of heroin. And people are like, well, no, can't be, this is Finland. No, read their documents. So actually the debate compared, because I used to think the debate like in Uruguay, which was very focally on cannabis, was so much more advanced than in Finland. But now in Finland, actually, it's a debate in some circles, and some authorities like DHL has jumped quite a long way, and it's like sort of decriminalization of all drugs is a fairly novel thing in Finland, and it's so it has changed, but still, of course, the conservative, the idea like drugs are bad, so let's prohibit everything around drugs. So the prohibitionist line is still very strong, but it's changing.
Yeah, and I think civil society has played a pretty big role in that, because I mean, for instance, the whole decriminalization of all drugs by THL, or the National Institute of Health, was partly a response for the decriminalization initiative of cannabis. They were like, we don't support decriminalization of cannabis alone, we support decriminalization of all drugs. So that cannabis initiative, even though it didn't really manage to get into as a law that it was trying to do, managed to push that kind of even further in a way.
Yes, certainly. I was actually just going to say about the importance of organizations like HPP and many others. Like it's the same thing in Uruguay. Sometimes I listen to international, I don't know what our Uruguayan friends here, they might say something about this later today, but international media talk. Oh, it was this great idea by this wonderful president who's humble and lives alone somewhere, world famous, Pepe Mujica, and he came up with the idea. But no, it was a civil society campaign since a long time ago that had many kinds of strains. And sometimes there are triggering events, like in Uruguay, actually the change, one triggering event. And I know here in Finland perhaps it might be useful, and I know some people are thinking about this, like if there's a legal case about something that helps to bring change, and highlight perhaps with something that may sound like civil disobedience or something like that. Even now, my colleague's law professor from the University of Helsinki has made something that sounds like proposing civil disobedience around these things. So in Uruguay there was this not young, originally from Argentina, writer woman who was, I think, growing some plants and writing, and then she gets legal trouble, and then how can it be that this elderly lady who's a writer and doesn't harm anyone, and now they detained her for some time. So it triggered like a movement. We need to have more clarity on legal issues. It was always legal to smoke in Uruguay, always been before that. But then there was this thing, you detain with police finds a couple of joints on you, so maybe your social class or something has an impact on whether it's your personal consumption or you are dealer and might go to prison. So they wanted to have more clarity on that, and then the balls started rolling, and they had this, in world history, very sort of avant-gardist at that moment, which is not so many years ago, it's less than 10 years ago, cannabis laws. And yeah.
I think this would be a good moment to watch a little clip of a documentary you've been making with Jaakko Jaskarin, who's also here.
Jaskarin Worldwide.
Jaskarin Worldwide, indeed. So we're going to watch a little clip. It's unpublished, so unfortunately for the audience at home, eventually you're not able to see it, but it will probably come out sometime this year. All right, we're going to watch this documentary teaser right now.
Täällä Montevidon kaupungintalolla on usein kaikenlaisia kansalaiskokouksia ja itsekin olen ollut seuraamassa pariakin mielenosoitusta täällä. Tässä tilassa uruguailaiset usein korostaa omia aika vahvoja kansalaisvapauksia ja aika usein täällä leijuu myös vähän semmoinen imelä tuoksu. Ihmiset polttavat kannabista ja se on vähän hassua, kun se tapahtuu tämän kaupungintalon edessä ja poliisejakin saattaa joskus olla paikalla ja kaikki on ihan lunkkia.
Hola, sí, vengo a retirar un cannabis. Sí.
Y Javier, tú has llegado a una farmacia a hacer compras. ¿Qué vas a comprar?
Bueno, en realidad voy a comprar cannabis, porque acá en Uruguay se puede comprar cannabis para recreación en las farmacias. Es un cannabis producido con regulación del Estado y todo un sistema también de registro previo de todos aquellos que quieren tener acceso. Y bueno, uno sigue un protocolo de reserva para venir a buscar, porque hay una cantidad siempre limitada y también un cierto tiempo entre una compra y otra.
Y no hay estigma social, nada, entras y perfecto, no tienes que tener miedo de que tu vecino te vea y...
Quizás al principio existía un poco ese prejuicio, pero ahora ya se ha naturalizado y no hay ningún problema.
Todo lo que todos teníamos miedos al inicio, todo eso quedó, no se concretó nunca, ni la condena social, es decir, es algo tan valioso para nosotros como la imagen y todo eso, pero no hubo ninguna, ni la persona más conservadora dejó de venir, es decir, no hubo un daño para la farmacia en eso.
Gracias.
¿Y qué tal las ventajas de comprar en una farmacia en vez de comprar en otro sitio?
Yo me siento más segura de comprar acá que comprar a una persona que o no conozco o no sé lo que me está vendiendo. Y aparte me parece el sabor es muy bueno y está controlado, entonces me da seguridad.
Sí. ¿Cuál sería matices diferentes de la política de gobierno anterior y ahora en cuanto a política de drogas?
A ver, por ejemplo, con respecto a la política de cannabis, ¿en qué lugar está puesto el centro de gravedad? Por ejemplo, durante toda la discusión del debate parlamentario sobre la ley, el énfasis estuvo puesto en que había que aprobar una ley que regulara el mercado de cannabis para combatir el narcotráfico. Y yo no estoy de acuerdo con eso. Yo creo que el centro de gravedad tiene que estar puesto en el derecho de los usuarios y que el efecto secundario de proteger el derecho de los usuarios es ganarle terreno al narcotráfico.
All right, that was a nice teaser of what's about to come. And at this point, I think I would like to invite a new speaker to join the discussion. And I'll let you introduce yourself and where you're from.
Hello, I'm Emiliano Sosa Barrios from Montevideo, Uruguay. Now I study at Helsingin yliopistosta at the Faculty of Social Sciences, and we also work with Teivo at the political science discipline. So, both worlds, south and north, at this point.
And I mean, this year is sort of the 10-year anniversary year of Uruguay doing this change with cannabis. Can you say something about how that has been going on?
Well, in terms of, for example, popular approval, when the law was approved by the legislative power, most of the Uruguayans weren't for. Most weren't against, but most weren't for the law. At this moment, there's an absolute majority of the voters, at least that's what the polls says, that are backing the law. Even if we face a change of government, a change of from the center-left party, Frente Amplio, or Broad Front in English, or at least that's Wikipedia says, to a center-right or right-wing coalition. And we had seen more continuities than changes in the global drug policy, even with some disagreements into the center-right, right-wing coalition.
Yeah, I think in the clip there was a government official who said that the initial kind of aim was to control the drug market, but now he was emphasizing user rights, which was quite refreshing to hear. Teivo, can you say a bit more about the documentary and your kind of time in Uruguay and how you've seen the kind of change? They also said that the worst fears didn't happen when they made this reform.
Yeah, sure. That dimension that Daniel Radillo, who's the, let's say, the highest drug policy authority in the country, emphasized the difference between individual rights and then the sort of social consequences was a bit dichotomous, as if the left government would not think also of individual liberties and all that. But it's a very fascinating distinction that in our earlier conversation also I think I mentioned my interest was on the one hand the drug war and violence and political economy and corruption and killings, all that, and on the other hand the more philosophical questions about individual autonomy and liberal rights. So it was nicely nailed by him in a little bit simplified way, but that sort of dichotomy to some extent does exist. Of course, if we think of liberal harm principle, then the consequences matter also. So it's not either or. I mean, your individual freedom to consume stuff, your liberty is conditioned in liberalism by through the harm principle if it doesn't cause too much harm to others, and then so the effects also play a role. So in the debate and what the fears were in Uruguay, of course, one thing is that indicators are more complicated than when you compare, let's say, the reform in Portugal 20 years ago, because then also much more harmful substances were involved in their legal status and policy changes there. So you can see more clearly the impact on health and social criminality, whatever indicators, whereas with cannabis, the sort of impact on health, for example, is much less important and more difficult to perceive. So therefore there are not so many numbers to show. As happened in Portugal, you would have policy change and then boo, you see indicators showing something. So in Uruguay because it's only cannabis, so their harms are less, so therefore the impact of making the reform is less. But as Emiliano was saying, the popular approval seems to have gone up. And it's actually interesting in terms of the initiative that people, according to the polls, were against it. So there is this dimension of a government making an initiative even against sort of perceived popular will. And so in that sense, one can, with the attributions to the Uruguayan government of doing something, being the initiators, so to speak, even though it came from civil society and other parts, are not totally wrong.
Has there been discussion about then other kinds of drug policy reforms in Uruguay itself, and has the cannabis reform in Uruguay also affected sort of neighboring countries and their thinking around this?
Well, there was some discussion, for example, about what it is similar to crack cocaine, pasta base, which is probably the most harmful drug and the most stigmatized drug or the consumers, as you say. But it was led from civil society and from the university and not for the government. So we haven't seen changes. In fact, Uruguay has a really high rate of incarceration per capita. So a lot of people that are in prison right now, a lot of thousands of I think maybe close to 15,000 prisoners in Uruguay, maybe 5K are there for drug-related crimes. I might be wrong with the numbers, but it's approximated. So a discussion is necessary, and the reform, for example, on micro-traffic penalization is necessary. For example, something that have happened with the new government, big law that is called law of urgent consideration. It's a package of a lot of articles, hundreds of articles that were approved in the new with the new parliament. In fact, hardened some of the penalties for example, people who bring drugs to consume into the prison, and that affected, for example, very harshly to poor women that were bringing the drugs for the consume of the prisoners.
There's one famous case, right, of that highlighting, like a woman bringing 10 grams to her husband to prison, something, and getting a very harsh sentence.
Yeah, like 4 to 5 years for that. So, in fact, the last president that held a very sanitaristic point of view, because he was a doctor and a titular professor from the University of the Republic, have suggested at some point that cocaine should be legalized, because in Uruguay we also have a big issue, a big trouble with cocaine consumption. I think that it is one of the countries in the world in terms of per capita consumption that it is ranks highest. The others are Argentina and, for example, the British Isles. So it's a big problem there.
So can you, Teivo, say about maybe has this Uruguayan example caused discussion or maybe reform pressure in the neighboring countries or across South America?
It has clearly impacted. For example, I was recently in Mexico, and in Mexico there's a legal reform in the parliament happening and partially approved. So in Mexico they speak quite a lot that the Uruguayan case has been an inspiration for the legal process in Mexico. So that's perhaps the clearest sort of direct impact. But there, I would assume with the new government in Colombia also, there will be new kinds of initiatives. One has to remember in some countries, and it's not so often highlighted in Colombia, in Peru, there is this tradition, let's call it liberal tradition, of personal doses. So actually in many other countries also drug use, personal consumption, and amounts that are considered doses for personal use are actually decriminalized, and so there's more like a sort of anti-prohibitionist tradition in Latin America already than we often think about. Also, you were asking about our film that we are making with Jaakko Jaskarin, and that we saw a little trailer on. There we try to document different aspects there, like talking with, as we saw now, with the highest drug policy authority, but also with civil society people. And for example, this woman who initiated the sort of legal, or triggered the legal change when she was arrested, and we have interviewed her and many other people there also. And Uruguay is an amazing place because there, for example, I've been there a couple of times, something called Expo Cannabis, a huge sort of exhibition organized by municipality of Montevideo, all kinds of ministries, business organizations, and then all you can imagine related to cannabis culture and paraphernalia and head shops and, you know, whatever. A huge sort of expo, which was also a nice place. We went there with Jaakko to film. I don't know if Jaakko wanted to say something about our experience in doing this documentary.
Yeah, for a Finnish person, of course, it was really eye-opening to see how down-to-earth people were with the subject there. And of course, I have a Finnish person's view, even though I travel a lot in the world. And it was really gave me confidence that this could happen in any modern society. And also, when we talked in the Netherlands with TNI, so the decriminalization of users is something that we have not really been discussing in Finland at all. Like how much trouble farmers and everyday people get in the world because they have no other option that farm drugs instead of food, because that's the way they make a living. It's much more profitable to farm drugs than food, and then they are being like criminalized and put into jail, and they have no human rights. And this is like a really serious problem, something that I did not even know about before we went there. And this is something like really something that would be highlighted in the discussion, in my point of view. Yeah.
Can I still add to Uruguayan importance, like compared to like initiatives of cannabis reform in some states of United States, Colorado, Washington, and then many others, that perhaps the Uruguayan experience is closer to the sort of like Nordic and Finnish history with alcohol, you know, prohibition and then state monopoly and all that. So in Uruguay, there's been this attempt also to do the reform in such ways that, let's say, big tobacco, big corporations will not come and dominate the field. And of course, then some critics might say it's too state controlled, and there's a state registry, for example. So if you want to be registered as a user who can buy from the pharmacies, for example, for recreational use or adult use, as they would say, then you have to be registered. There's no seeming danger of repression against registered users, but as a principle, it's a little bit, you know, the state will know that you're registered as a user of a substance that's widely in the world seen as prohibited drugs. So the US approach is more market-centered and perhaps more capitalist in that sense. And the Uruguayan way is a little bit closer to and has more analogies with the way in Finland and Sweden there was alcohol was dealt with. So that's why it might be a special interest for Nordic audiences also to study the Uruguayan experience.
Yeah, that was sort of my next question. Like, would this work in Finland, for instance, having this kind of like a pharmacy model that's not too market-driven? I mean, seems to work quite well there. Would it work here as well? I don't know if you have experience of, you know, Finnish society. Do you think that kind of model could also work here?
I think that in a idiosyncratic way, it totally would work. Something to add is that from the 70K registered people, 50K are into the pharmacy system, and moreover 20K are into they plant themselves, or they are into a system that it is similar to the Spanish experience of cannabis clubs. And sometimes, for example, the National Conservative Wing of this coalition, that the current coalition, is suspicious, for example, of the cannabis clubs, as for example, they make focus on that they might be inclined to break the rules more, for example, than the pharmacies. That's something interesting to address also from a liberal standpoint. And also some other thing that, for example, would incline the Finnish society to accept this kind of model. It has to be with something that it is happening in Uruguay, that some pharmaceutical or bioeconomy in a broad sense is growing because of the law. And for example, the universities here and the private sector would, for example, make a good use of a broad law that not only deals with consumption or recreative use of the drug, but also with health and pharmaceutic policy. For example, I think, Teivo, can you refresh us of what the chairman of MTK position on that was?
Well, here in Finland, it's been interesting to observe that some people within traditionally conservative quarters of our political spectrum, like the Agrarian Center Party and the agrarian production-related organizations, sometimes they see like, okay, there's a future for Finnish countryside, there are issues, and what's the future? So maybe there's future in cannabis markets and small farming and all that, and sometimes making funny jokes like, oh, maybe we could get some of the Kallio, where we are located now, the hippies from, hipster neighborhoods move to become, micro-level cultivators to make the countryside more livable again. And there has been openness. So it's this sort of commercial and commercial aspect, which has been important also in Uruguay, even though it's state-controlled, but there are corporations. It reminds me of, I was once in Guyana during April 20th, and there was the cannabis march. It's very illegal there, so you wouldn't see anybody really smoking, you wouldn't smell anything. But then there were people who were like, this is for our exports. This is the future, arguing with suits, and we go to the ministry and we argue cannabis is good for diversification of exports and something. But the problem is these Rastafarians are there, and people think like, marijuana is the Rastafarians, and sort of thinking then for our business initiatives, it's bad that in this march we have the Rastafarians and the ministry people don't take us seriously. So this sort of dichotomy between the business interests and that can be very conservative, and then the sort of idea like here, the hippies from this neighborhood or something. But Uruguay shows like different interests can coincide, and United States also, and Canada. So you have business interests, and you have sort of individual rights interests, and then the whole harm reduction sort of crowd with variety of social movements and people behind it. So one of the big things, if there is a legalization in many countries, is how to see that if one thinks it would be a problem that, let's say, big tobacco moves to cannabis, or big corporations will start controlling it, and then you have all kinds of monopolies, and the state monopoly, one good response to that. So in Uruguay, the home growing and the cannabis clubs are also meant to have sort of more autonomous, from below kind of ways of producing and cultivating. The pharmacy is still about perhaps Uruguay, like when we talk about pharmacies, it's a little bit, it's a dispensary, because sometimes people, when you say, well, it's distributed through pharmacies, but it's not medical cannabis. So So because normally we think of medical when we think of pharmacies, it just happens to be that pharmacies are the mechanism of distribution. It could be other forms of dispensaries, like in Canada, for example. But yes, and what Emiliano was saying about the clubs and all that. The clubs, I think one complaint is the law says clubs need to have between 15 and 45 members, and sometimes it's too many, but often it's too few to make it commercially. They shouldn't make a profit. They should be non-profit operations. And they are not social, as different from Spain. They are not clubs in the sense of social clubs where you're supposed to go and sit down and have a smoke. No, you go there to, of course, things may happen, but technically, legally, isn't it so? You're supposed to just go there and, get your part of what the club has been growing and not to stay there and hang out and, smoke around. So they are not clubs in the Spanish sense.
We could probably continue discussing this very long from now, but unfortunately we have to start wrapping things up. Maybe as a sort of last thing, predicting the future is always very difficult, but, next 5 years, what kind of changes are you seeing or hoping to see? And another very easy question, what do you think humane drug policy is?
Well, both in Uruguay or in Finland, I think that mancomunated civil society, institutional and academic advancement will show the way to the voters, as you say. And let's hope that Finland would, I don't know, it's if we can say follow the example of Uruguay in decriminalizing cannabis, but also Finland has to show Uruguay and other countries and itself how it can transform, for example, its drug policy in a research-driven and human-driven policy, because I think that the institutional elements are here. For example, you were mentioning Teivo, and I think that as an institution has a very sensitive policy, but I think that the problem might be even the voters in that sense, but that's only my opinion. As if the question was about humane drug policy, I think that it is a very, very difficult and good question to ask, but I would say that it is important that the drug policy is right-based and not, for example, identity-based, or, for example, as Radio said, we cannot think, for example, on a drug policy only oriented to enhance security of the state, for example. We have to think in our everyday life and the freedoms that we want for us and we want for the rest of the citizens.
Yeah, well, Emiliano, you were saying about the research-driven part. It's good to remember, like in Uruguay, the biggest university has a cannabis study center, which is University of Helsinki, where we work, just signed a cooperation agreement with the biggest university of Uruguay. So it's perhaps that dimension of research will come there too. Things to observe in the near future, coming 5 years or something. In Europe, it will be interesting to see if Germany introduces legal reforms around the issue, how much impact that will have on European sort of debate. Also, of course, some people are saying that in the United States, the state-by-state legal reform has advanced, but if there was a federal drug policy reform, then that would also be interesting to see. I'm not claiming that international drug policy depends on the US, and there's a very interesting debate on whether the prohibitionist regime in the single convention and somewhere whether it's a sort of United States-led colonial kind of thing, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. But in any case, if United States changes, then I think there will be changes. Here in Finland, it's interesting. For example, my colleague in the university in law faculty, Professor Kimmo Nuotio, who's in no means a usual suspect in this field, but a serious, professor of criminal law and all that, and he was. I think he was like commenting, was it last year, he was suggested or something, okay, study, what is the legal basis in terms of Finnish sort of legal history in Finnish state for prohibiting, consumption of these kinds of substances? And then he comes to the conclusion, there is no basis. I mean, what's the basis of prohibiting, like legally speaking, in terms of Finnish legal tradition? So I think, I'm mentioning him not only because he's a nice guy and a friend and all that, but also because when you make people really reflect on what is it about that self-harm should be prohibited in legal traditions like the Finnish legal tradition, and since it's not like, if I cut myself with a knife, it's bad, something probably should do about it, or I don't know, some people might, okay, let her do it, let him do it, whatever, but it's not like it should be criminalized. So self-harm, the legal base for criminalizing that is dubious. And I think now that in Finland there is a new debate opening on this, I would expect that at least rationally thinking people, many of whom are still within the prohibitionist camp, might have a good moment for rethinking their ideas. Where that leaves and whether it's simplistic to think, look at Portugal, what happened there, and Portugal is a fairly clear case that you decriminalize, depenalize, don't punish the users in the old way, that it did have a nice effect on social and health indicators. Whether it means that in Finland something similar would happen, or is there something about Finnish idiosyncrasy that means that we cannot assume that something similar will happen, is an open question, and more research and reflection is needed on that. But I think times are, and the debates are changing and becoming a little bit more rational.
I think we'll leave it to that. Thank you for your discussion and participation, and we'll continue the program at 1:30 with Kim Kannustari. So thank you everybody for joining, and thank you especially for you for discussion.